Alright, so now this seminar is of course about British television comedy, and so far we've covered quite a bit of ground when it comes to the television part of the seminar, while simultaneously we have sort of neglected the comedy part, something which I would like to change with this very video. Now, comedy is a genre that is not only well liked by many, but that has been perceived similarly to visual culture and popular culture as local, as vulgar, and as an antithesis to a vision of art that believed in its ability to communicate beyond the moment of its creation, like, for instance, tragedy or other high-quality dramas. Now, if we talk about comedy, it seems suitable to briefly touch upon the terminology and the usage of both the word comic and the word comedy. Comedy and the comic are notoriously difficult concepts to define, and no single definition as such exists to this very date. Generically, comedy relies on transgression and cultural deviation and sometimes deformity and monstrosity. All instances of the comic, of that which is specifically designed to be funny, as Neil and Krutnik rightly point out, are founded on the transgression of decorum, on deviation from any social or aesthetic rule, norm, model, convention or law. Such deviations are the basis of comic surprise. While both terms are at times used interchangeably, there is a slight distinction to be made. Whereas the principal meaning of comic is causing or meaning to cause laughter, and thus embodies one of comedy's main criteria, comedy is more of an aesthetic term, a term that has two distinct kinds of meaning. On the one hand, comedy may refer to the genre as a whole, in which case it either explicitly or implicitly includes each of its various criteria, each of its various forms, and each of its various works. Or, on the other hand, it can refer to particular works, such as The Merry Wives of Windsor is a comedy. The latter usage, a comedy, is, as Neil and Krutnik note, more restricted insofar as certain programs cannot be simply referred to as a comedy, as the indefinite article tends to imply a definite narrative form and definite narrative criteria. While comic might thus be comparatively simple, comedy is a multi-layered concept, which offers a set of terminological distinctions, a variety of forms, and a number of different generic criteria, all of which only correspond with the other to a very limited degree. As such, as a label, comedy can be applied across a range of styles, including traditional categories such as pastoral comedy, farce, burlesque, pantomime, satire, and the comedy of manners. Yet it also applies to more modern subdivisions, like cartoons, sitcoms, sketch comedy, slapstick cinema, stand-up, and some game shows, but also impressionists, caricatures, and even silly walks. Yet defining comedy more broadly, we can use it as a means of organizing and understanding a series of persistent themes that we encounter again and again across a variety of settings. These themes include various forms of inversion, the sort of world turned upside down scenario, for instance, where the slave governs the master or the man bites the dog. Foolishness, intellectual myopia, or the rigid insistence on inflexible systems of being or thinking are ridiculed by transformations of different kinds, investigations of alternative identities, or a relaxation of social codes and a suspension of laws governing the body. The matter-of-fact comprehensibility of language is comprised by linguistic contortions that produce parallel or nonsensical forms of meaning. One of the more famous examples, apart from the very well-known Dead Parrot sketch, would for instance be this example from A Bit of Fry and Laurie, in which a game show is absolutely ridiculed, as neither the words the contestants actually come up with do make sense in any sort, form or capacity.
Or there is an 8, actually.
An 8? 8. So, 8. Well, that's 8. That's very interesting. So, what's your 8?
Sloblock.
Sloblock. So, sloblock. Right, sloblock. And what does sloblock mean exactly?
Basically, sloblock means balls. The things we keep in our scrotums. Or by extension, something that is rubbish or a pile of nonsense. Oh, that's a load of sloblock, you might say.
In all these, regardless of where they appear, a notion of comedy is always at work. Comedy is a term that can refer equally to a genre, a tone, and a series of effects that manifest themselves in diverse environments. Even though it seems both somewhat insufficient and sufficient to define the terminology and the criteria that comedy encompasses, that means, for instance, a happy ending, the generation of laughter, recognizable stock social situation, only to name a few. Andrew Stott also notes that rather than describing the formula of comedy, scholars and academics should rather investigate the function and purpose it serves and what, if anything, its social function or philosophical value apart from giving pleasure is. As such, comedy answers a multitude of purposes, with comedy first and foremost being able to, in part, realistically represent the human condition, as works of comedy are capable to delight as well as to instruct, and as vicious people are made ashamed of their follies and faults by seeing them exposed in a ridiculous manner, so are good people at once warned and diverted at their expense. Moreover, Kirby also notes that comedy, both as a concept and as a definition, is simply an affront to rationality and meta-narratives that attempt to exhaustively explain or incorporate all aspects of the world. And he writes, comedy is an immanent form that does not make us look into the heavens or to God for answers to questions. Comic theory traces a larger discourse over politics of the body and, within that discourse, between orthodoxy and heresy. Like desire, laughter is strangely fluid and cannot be contained by rational thought. Stott even goes beyond this framing and argues that comedy is not just a narrative or an aesthetic form, but can be understood as a social activity. An activity that is usually written and produced with a certain kind of audience in mind, and which, according to and within certain cultural social contexts, is produced from the matter of dominant cultural assumptions and commonplaces. What is considered funny in a particular cultural and national context is similarly defined by culture, a notion that seemingly runs counter to the assumption that comedy is always inherently transgressive, or as Olson frames it, a certain freedom from definition. In fact, Stott argues that while comedy often seems to be suspending, inverting, or abandoning dominant norms, these inversions are produced in relation to the cultural orthodoxies from which they must always begin. This, of course, ties comedy inevitably to the culture that surrounds it, a culture that, to an extent, determines what is considered funny and what is not. That does not mean, of course, that comedy is never transgressive or able to suspend or invert or abandon dominant norms. In fact, comedy and jokes need to utilize inversions and incongruities because jokes rely upon a culturally defined sense of incompatible orders, such as, for instance, the displacement of people or discourses, in order to produce ambiguity and the feeling that normality has been momentarily decentered for pleasurable ends. While we're talking, of course, about social and cultural incongruities, Sigmund Freud's work on jokes highlights the psychological incongruities also, as he saw joking revealing of an underside to socially constructed reason. For Sigmund Freud, a joke is an example of parapraxis, an act like a mistake or a slip of the tongue that exposes something of the repressed thoughts hidden in the unconscious. Like dreams, he says, jokes contain significant information about unconscious thoughts and the nature of inhibitions. And the production of a joke is a means of negotiating the psychological barrier that exists between the conscious and the unconscious. And now you should be familiar with the following assumption. Because I argue that in this vein, comedy is not radical or conservative, but rather it is a terrain of struggle in which cultural assumptions and potential transgressions are negotiated. Comedy thus has a dual role. On the one hand, possessing the power to challenge social norms, as comedy is a subversive form of rhetoric, allowing people to challenge social hierarchies and political authorities in ways that could be a potential prelude to social and political change. On the other hand, however, comedy similarly has the power to reinforce those very social norms and hierarchies, as power absorbs the potential for change, permitting itself to be questioned for the tactical and pragmatic purposes of seeming to appear open, before finally reasserting itself once more. Stephen Greenblatt similarly argues that within the setting of comedy programs, there's a remarkable insistence upon the paradoxes, the ambiguities, and the tensions of authority. But this apparent production of subversions is the very condition of power in the first place. While this does not mean that power is unilaterally reaffirmed, after all, of course, ironic reservations usually persist, the open, sustained and radical questioning nonetheless leads to a reaffirmation of the very conditions of power and authority in which the comedy is situated in. As such, comedy and comic situations, which are ambiguous in nature, are dependent on context, on group belonging, on conditions of power, as well as the relationship between the audience and the joke teller. Jokes which, moreover, require a great deal of interpretive work from both the joke teller and the audience. Very brief intermission right here, because I've just noticed how long this video is going to be if I do the video as I had planned to, which would have been a very brief introduction to the genre of sitcom and why sitcoms are important, basically going through the same structure that I've done with visual culture and popular culture. I decided against that, so the only thing you'll find in the following is the example concerning Little Britain and comedy, and how sort of our ideas of what is funny and what is appropriate have changed over the years. Now, how I'm going to end this intermission, would over and out be appropriate? I have no idea, but have fun with the rest of the video. Now, Little Britain consists of character-based short sketches, a format that has sort of populated British TV since the 1950s, and the most popular series of which include, for instance, A Bit of Fry and Laurie, French and Saunders, Absolutely, The Fast Show, or Big Train, and of course many others. The sketches center on the performance of Matt Lucas and David Williams, and a group of actors that make repeated appearances throughout the series. Little Britain uses the well-established format of canned laughter, a soundtrack added to the show to indicate moments when the audience is expected to laugh, no matter if the situation is actually funny or not. Each episode consists of 13 to 20 sketches of varying length, with a tendency towards longer sketches in the later series. Most, if not all, of these sketches are introduced by an off-screen narrator, that is Tom Baker, who acts as a presenter and delivers humorous comments with a punchline, thus comprising a main source of humor apart from the actual sketches. Tom Baker's supplementary humorous role is introduced from the very beginning of the series onwards, because he also narrates the intro. The intro which we are going to have a very brief look at right now.
Britain, 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 land of technological achievement. We've had running water for over 10 years, an underground tunnel that links us to Peru, and we invented the cat. But none of these innovations would have been possible were it not for the people of Britain.
He acts in his role as a guide, supposedly familiarizing foreign viewers with the British way of life, and also announces the setting of the individual sketches. For instance, advertising a Scottish holiday retreat by noting that if all spots in the Arctic are already fully booked, visitors might enjoy a stay in Scotland instead. An introduction that is sort of underlined by a couple putting on sunscreen while a pan shot reveals them to be sitting in pouring rain somewhere in Scotland. The series employs a variety of tried and true comedy techniques of British television, often a combination of grotesque appearance and powerful punchlines. A major source of humor in the sketches rests on repetition, which has the characters reacting in a familiar and similar way over and over again. As such, Carol Beer, for instance, usually performs her frequent inquiries with a pronounced lack of zeal, and usually states that computer says no. Similarly, David Thomas repeatedly insists that he is the only gay in the village, while remaining totally oblivious to the pervasive queerness all around him. One of the staples of the show are the sketches with Emily Howard, and according to the BBC Comedy Character Guide, unconvincing transvestite who desperately attempts and fails to pass as a high society lady. Emily's friend Florence is, for all appearances, even more of a rubbish transvestite, with her moustache being clearly visible and usually only partially integrated in her outfits. The show has been heavily criticized by both its creators and LGBTQ groups, with both Williams and Lucas stating that if I could go back and do Little Britain again, I wouldn't make these jokes about transvestites. I wouldn't play black characters. Basically, I wouldn't make that show now. It would upset people. We made a more cruel kind of comedy than I would do now. Nonetheless, the show's depiction and representation of transvestites has also garnered more favourable reviews. Some scholars have argued that Emily Howard should rather be understood as a subversive character, a character who bends and undoes gender, and who embodies a gender flexibility that brings about identity crisis, not so much in herself, but in the fixed notions of gender, class, nation, and indeed the stability of identity itself. Such destabilizing potential, they contend, makes both Emily and Florence subversive characters. As Judith Butler wrote in Undoing Gender, norms of identity can be undone. Under certain conditions, seemingly fixed identity categories will reveal their instability and lay themselves open to potential resignification. While Butler is of course not writing specifically about transvestites here, her notion of undoing is a useful supplement to Marjorie Garber's 1992 text, Vested Interests, Cross-Dressing and Cultural Anxiety. Garber argues that the function of transvestite figures in art and literature is to indicate a category crisis. In the face of certain gender-flexible acts, seemingly impermeable boundaries between categories such as male and female prove to be permeable after all. And this permeability constitutes a crisis in fixed identity categories such as gender, for instance. Butler also suggests that becoming gendered is always to a certain extent becoming gendered for others. In other words, it is the space between self and others that gender is formed and continuously renegotiated. In this space, identities get done, undone and redone, but so too do these social norms which determine the limits of these identities. In Little Britain's sketches, which are campy and narratively inflexible, Emily's performance relies also on repetition of catchphrases and visible incongruities between being a man and being a woman. As a performance, rubbish transvestite Emily Howard threatens the stability of gender itself. Emily repeatedly cites the paraphernalia of femininity as evidence of her femaleness.
This is my room. It has all my ladies' things in it. My lotions, my petticoats, my ladies' things.
When her credibility is, however, challenged, he replies,
Well, I can't use a razor, I'm a lady.
The vocal citation of feminine accessoires suggests the disproportionate role played by surface appearance in identity construction. It also potentially reveals to an external audience the artificiality of gender. Garber writes of cross-dressing. What is really at stake here is a subconscious recognition that woman in patriarchal society is conceived of as an artifact. And the logical next step is the recognition that man is likewise constructed, made of detachable parts. This is the anxiety that lies beneath the laughter. Similarly, if Emily Howard can don the embellishments of femininity and still not achieve femaleness, perhaps maleness is equally unattainable. Laughter in this case fulfills a bit of a double function. On the one hand, we laugh at Emily for her continuous failings to pass as either a man or a woman. We take up a laughing at position at those who do not conform to a particular norm, thereby merely reiterating this norm. Similarly, if we laugh with a nonconformist at the norm, we acknowledge and thereby reaffirm the power of that norm also. However, on the other hand, laughter also unveils. We do not necessarily laugh at Emily Howard or with her, but we laugh at the reactions of others around her. We laugh at their potentially rigid norms of male and female and at their inability to recognize and deal with ambiguities. Thus, her depiction suspends the rigid regimes of normality with performances and behavior patterns and practices dialogues, images of surreal absurdity and grotesque exaggeration, inviting the audience to question the moral ground of cherished norms and established values in the first place. Yet this performance arose, of course, from cultural orthodoxies, in the sense that the joke was not so much on the reaction of others, but mostly on Emily's inability to pass as a proper woman, and simultaneously by dressing as a woman, not being able to pass as a proper man. Little Britain in this context sought to offend, yes, of course it did, but it also conformed to, confirmed, and legitimized gender binaries through this performance, a performance that has been rightly so criticized as being problematic and downright transphobic. And while calls of too much political correctness have abounded, the political, social, and cultural circumstances of the joke's production have shifted dramatically. What was an offensive but ultimately kind of funny skit in 2003 has become more and more offensive as the awareness of the plights and discriminations faced by transgender individuals has risen. That does not mean that jokes about minority groups cannot be made, no matter how cheap punching down might seem. In fact, Todd Glass has argued that you can be crass, you can be vulgar, and it's not about worrying about offending people. Fuck offending people. Offend the right fucking people. No one said you shouldn't offend people, but make sure you're doing it to the right group. As such, offensive and gross humor hasn't lost its appeal or its right to exist. But Little Britain's humor, back then and now, nonetheless adds to the political, social and cultural disenfranchising of those who do not quite fit the normative frameworks we have established.